In the autumn of 1987, Harlan County, Kentucky recorded its driest September in 41 years. The tobacco leaves curled at the edges like burnt paper. The corn had gone to nothing before August was even done. 11 family farms filed for bankruptcy that fall alone, and the county extension office ran out of the emergency seed vouchers they'd printed in June, having never once in 15 prior years needed to use them all. The First Savings Bank of Harlan had begun the slow, quiet process of calling in loans it had been sitting on for years, and men who had farmed the same ridge lines as their grandfathers stood in their kitchens holding certified letters and saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say. It was into this world, on a Tuesday morning in late October, that Maren Colley drove her 1979 Ford pickup down Route 119 toward the old Dutton Creamery property, the one that had sat empty going on 6 years. The truck was the color of dried clay. The passenger window didn't roll all the way down. There was a crack in the windshield that had been there so long Maren had stopped seeing it, the way you stop seeing a scar on your own hand. She was 53 years old. She had $31 in her checking account, a jar of coins on the kitchen counter that she'd counted twice that week and once more at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and a cashier's check for $800 drawn from the money her mother had left her when she passed the previous spring. The creamery sat at the end of a gravel lane off the county road, behind a rusted cattle gate that had been wired shut so long the wire had grown into the wood of the gate post. The buildings were stone and board, the old dairy barn with its gambrel roof half collapsed on the eastern end, the creamery house itself with its tall windows painted over in white, the spring house down the slope near the creek still standing straight as it had in 1921 when Jonas Dutton built it from creek stone by hand. There were 31 acres in the parcel. The back 18 ran up the ridge in second growth timber, oak and poplar mostly, with a seam of limestone along the crest that caught the morning light when the leaves were off the trees. The bottom 13 acres lay flat along Clover Branch, and that soil, Maren knew, was different from anything else in that part of the county. She knew it because her father had told her so, and his father before him had told him, and the knowing went back further than that, back to when the Duttons and the Colleys had farmed neighboring ground and the old men had stood at fence lines in the evening and talked about what the land could do. She was the only one at the auction who was not a man. There were 7 of them standing in the gravel beside the county road. Ed Pierce from the First Savings Bank wore a tie and held a clipboard. Boyd Mackey was there, who ran 300 acres up on the plateau and drove a new Dodge pickup every other year. Ray Stultz had come, and his brother Dennis. 2 men Maren didn't recognize, from somewhere else, wearing clean boots that had never been in mud. And old Clete Harbison, who was 74 and had been at every land auction in the county for the past 30 years and had never once bought anything, who came because he liked to watch and because at 74 there wasn't much else going on. Ed Pierce cleared his throat when he saw Maren pull in. He didn't say anything. He looked at his clipboard. Boyd Mackey looked at her truck, then at her, then back at his brother-in-law Ray Stultz, and something passed between them that didn't need words. "Clete," she said. The auction took 11 minutes. The 2 men in clean boots dropped out early. Ray Stultz went to $1,200 and then shook his head and stepped back. Boyd Mackey went to $1,400, looked at Maren, waited for her to quit, and when she said $1,500 his jaw tightened in a way that meant he was deciding whether this was worth his pride. He let it go. Ed Pierce said, "Sold. $1,500. Maren wrote a check for $700 more than she had planned to spend. She drove home on the county road with the windows down even though it was cold, and she cried the whole way, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular feeling of having crossed a line you cannot uncross, the feeling of having said yes to something enormous and terrifying and true. When she told her neighbor Patsy Giles what she'd paid, Patsy set down her coffee cup and said, "Maren. Honey. That place is a ruin." When Boyd Mackey heard the number at the feed store the following Saturday, he laughed. Not a mean laugh, not quite, but the kind that carries a full measure of disbelief and a smaller measure of contempt. "800, he said, having heard it wrong, and the number became the version that stuck. She paid $800 for the Dutton place. And the men around the counter shook their heads the way you shake your head at a child who has done something foolish but not yet learned better. Maren knew they were talking. In a county of 12,000 people, there is no such thing as a private decision. She had known these people her whole life. She had gone to school with some of their fathers. She had sat in the same church pews, eaten at the same homecoming suppers, watched the same tobacco auctions and the same livestock sales and the same slow turning of the seasons that governed everything. She did not mind that they were talking. She had learned a long time ago that what people say about you before you've done something and what they say after are two entirely different conversations, and only one of them matters. What she did not tell anyone, not Patsy Giles, not her son Damon who called from Lexington and said, "Mom, what are you thinking?" Not even Clete Harbison who she trusted most among living souls, was what she knew about that bottom ground along Clover Branch. She had known it since she was 9 years old. Her father, Earl Colley, had kept a notebook. Not a diary. Earl was not a man who spoke of feelings, not even to paper. It was a working notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and it was full of observations written in pencil in his careful cramped hand. Soil temperatures by date. First frost dates going back to 1952. Rainfall measurements from the coffee can he kept nailed to the corner post of the old tobacco barn, faithfully emptied and recorded every Sunday morning after church for 30 years. Notes on what grew where and how, what responded to lime and what didn't, which fields held moisture and which shed it, which low corners flooded and which ones, surprisingly, did not. And there was a section on the Dutton bottom. Earl had worked the Dutton place for 2 seasons in the early 1960s, when Jonas Dutton's son Harley was having his troubles and needed help and Earl needed the extra income. He had written about the soil along Clover Branch with a specificity that bordered on reverence. Deep alluvial. Dark to 18 inches. Good aggregate structure, no hardpan I can find. Holds moisture without sitting wet. Warms early. pH around 6.2 without amendment. He had written, this ground would grow anything you asked it to. It just needs someone to ask. Harley Dutton had asked it to grow hay, because hay was what he knew, and the hay had been fine. Then the Creamery had failed in 1981 when the big dairy cooperatives squeezed out the small operations, and the Dutton family had moved to Ohio, and the land had grown nothing but ragweed and thistle and, along the fence lines, the slow patient return of the forest, which does not hurry but does not stop. Maren had read her father's notebook so many times she could recite portions of it the way some people recite scripture. She kept it in the drawer of her nightstand, under her reading glasses and the small photograph of her husband Gerald, who had been dead 11 years. Gerald had been a good man and a fair farmer, but he had not had her father's gift for reading land. Maren had inherited the gift, she believed, though she would not have used the word gift. She would have said she paid attention. She would have said the land talks if you're quiet enough to listen. She could not afford equipment. That was the first fact she had to sit with, and she sat with it for 3 days before she started working around it. She had the truck, a pull-behind tiller she'd been using on her half-acre kitchen garden for 15 years, 2 worn-out hoes, and a wheelbarrow with a slow leak in the tire. She had seeds, her own seeds, saved from her garden over 20 years, paper envelopes in an old recipe box organized by year and variety, the kind of archive that seed companies would like you to believe is unnecessary and that any experienced gardener knows is the most necessary thing in the world. She had her father's notebook. She had her hands and her back, which were 53 years old and had worked every day of those years and knew it. The first thing she did that November was walk the property. Not once but many times, in different weathers, at different times of day. She walked it in the cold morning fog when the creek bottom smelled of iron and leaf mold. She walked it on the bright afternoons when the ridge threw shadow down across the bottom fields and you could see exactly where the cold air settled and pooled. She walked it after rain, in rubber boots, pressing her heel into the softened ground in different spots to feel how the water moved and where it went. She dug test holes in a grid pattern across the bottom 13 acres, a dozen of them, each 18 inches deep, and she looked at the soil profile the way her father had taught her, the layering and color and texture and smell of it. Her father had been right. The soil was extraordinary. It was dark to 14 inches on the high edge of the bottom and dark to 22 inches in the central swale where 10,000 years of flood deposits had built something that no amount of fertilizer money could replicate. The color was the color of a good chocolate cake, that deep reddish brown that means iron and organic matter in the right proportions. When she pressed a handful of it and released, it held its shape for a moment and then crumbled at exactly the right rate. She had been farming long enough to know that feel was a form of knowledge. She spent those early winter months planning. She made lists on yellow legal pads, columns of numbers crossed out and rewritten, the math of what she might grow and what she might sell and what it might take to get there. She drove to the county library in Harlan and sat at a table for 2 full Saturdays reading back issues of farming publications, making notes. She called the extension office and talked to a young man named Kevin who was helpful in the cautious way of people who don't quite believe what they're hearing but are too polite to say so. She was going to grow vegetables. Not the commodity crops, not corn or tobacco or soybeans, the crops of big equipment and chemical programs and markets that had been squeezing small farmers for 30 years. She was going to grow specialty vegetables and herbs for the restaurant trade in Lexington, a market she had read about and thought hard about, a market that was beginning to pay real money for food grown the old way, in old soil, by someone who knew what they were doing. It was an insane idea for a woman alone in Harlan County in 1988 with $1,500 invested in a ruined creamery and 31 acres of ground she didn't yet own clear because the closing wouldn't happen until December. She knew it was insane. She did it anyway. The winter was her preparation. She borrowed a soil knife from Kevin at the extension office and sampled every section of the bottom thoroughly, sending the samples to the state lab in Frankfurt. She got the results back in February and they were better than her father's notes had suggested. The pH was 6.4, the phosphorus was high naturally, the organic matter reading was the highest the extension office had recorded from the county in a decade. Kevin called her when he got the copies of the results, and his voice had shifted from polite skepticism to something else, a kind of careful interest. "Where exactly is this ground?" he said. "Clover Branch Bottom," Maren said. "Dutton Place." There was a pause. "Dutton Place has been fallow 6 years, Kevin said. "I know it," Maren said. "Best thing that ever happened to it." She cleared the fence lines herself that February, working in whatever daylight the short days gave her, pulling old barbed wire with leather gloves and a fence post puller her father had left her, rolling the wire and stacking the old posts. Her shoulders ached from the 3rd day onward. She took aspirin with her morning coffee and kept working. She burned the brush she cleared in a long windrow fire on the cold evenings, watching the sparks rise in the dark air above the creek, and she felt something she could not have fully explained, not happiness exactly, but rightness, the sensation of being in the correct place doing the correct work. She did not hire help. She could not afford to. What she did instead was make an arrangement with a boy named Curtis Frazier, who was 17 and living with his grandmother on the county road because his parents were gone, one to a car accident, one to something else that no one talked about directly, and who had the particular energy of a young person with nowhere to put it. She offered him $20 a week and 2 meals a day and the use of the small apartment above the creamery barn once she got it livable, which she promised would be before cold weather the following fall. Curtis looked at her for a long time when she made this offer. He was tall, thin, with his grandmother's eyes and a habit of going very still when he was thinking that reminded Maren of her father. "I don't know anything about farming," Curtis said. "I know," Maren said. "I'll teach you what I know." Curtis moved into his grandmother's spare room temporarily and began showing up at the Dutton Place. Maren had started calling it the Clover Branch Place in her own mind, refusing to carry the old failure in the name, at 7 in the morning, 6 days a week. He was strong and willing and he listened in the way that some young people listen, not just waiting for a pause but actually receiving what was being said. Maren taught him to read the soil the way her father had taught her. She taught him what frost does to different plants at different stages, how to feel whether a furrow is at the right depth, how to thin a row without grieving over what you're pulling, how to water deeply and infrequently rather than shallowly and often. She taught him to look at a leaf and see in its color and texture what the plant was telling you, the nitrogen deficiency that shows as yellowing from the oldest leaves up, the calcium problem that shows at the growing tip, the spider mite damage that looks like dust until you look close and see it moving. Curtis absorbed it all with that still, focused attention. He had few questions in the first weeks, and then, around March, he began asking very good ones. They had the ground ready to plant by the first week of April, a full 2 weeks ahead of most of the conventional farms in the county because the bottom ground warmed early. Her father had noted this, and because they had worked it right, not too wet, not overworked, just broken and amended with a modest load of composted manure from a dairy farm 3 miles away that Maren had arranged to haul herself in 3 loads in the pickup truck. The truck had nearly died on the 3rd trip under the weight and Curtis had walked alongside it up the grade, ready to put rocks under the tires if it quit moving, and when they made it Maren had laughed until her eyes watered standing in the driveway, which she hadn't done in a long time. They planted in a system Maren had worked out on her yellow legal pad through the winter, a succession planting that would give them harvests rolling through from May to October. Lettuce and spinach and arugula in the first plantings, followed by tomatoes and peppers and basil when the danger of frost passed. Summer squash and cucumbers and green beans. Then fall plantings of kale and chard and the hardy greens that Maren knew from experience got sweeter after the first frost, which the restaurants in Lexington were beginning to pay a premium for. She grew herbs along the south-facing edge of the Creamery building where the stone held warmth, basil and thyme and several varieties of oregano, and 3 kinds of heirloom tomatoes from seeds she had been growing out for 8 years that produced fruit the color of sunset in colors you did not see in any grocery store. She called on restaurants herself. This was perhaps the hardest part for a woman of her temperament, who had spent her life working quietly and letting the work speak. She drove to Lexington in April with a cooler of early spring greens and a list of restaurants she had gathered from a food magazine at the library, and she walked into kitchen she had no appointment to enter and asked for the chef and said, "I grow food on ground that's been resting for 6 years. I grow it the old way. I think you should try it." Most of them didn't have time for her. 2 of them told her to come back. One of them, a young woman named Chandra who ran a small restaurant on Short Street that had been written about in Lexington magazine the previous year, took a handful of arugula from the cooler and ate it standing at her prep station and said, quietly, "Where has this been?" That was May. By June, Chandra was taking everything Maren could bring her. By July, the second restaurant had called. By August, she had 4 accounts in Lexington and was making the drive twice a week in the pickup with the windows down and the coolers wedged in the truck bed and the radio playing whatever came in clearly enough to hear. The bottom fields that summer were something to see. Maren had not told anyone what she was doing in any detail. She had said she was starting a market garden, which was true and small enough sounding that people didn't ask much more. But the fields themselves told the story to anyone who drove the county road and looked through the gap in the tree-line where the gate was. Rows so clean and full they looked like a picture from a catalog. Tomatoes staked and tied with strips of old cotton sheet the way her mother had done. The deep waxy green of the pepper plants in August sunlight. The kale standing in the late summer heat like something from another world, blue-green, and upright and utterly alive. Curtis was taller by August. He had filled out through the shoulders from the work. He had stopped being tentative about the soil and started being confident, not the false confidence of someone who doesn't know what they don't know, but the real kind that comes from having made mistakes and corrected them and made different mistakes and corrected those. He had lost a row of basil to damping off in June and taken it harder than Maren expected, standing at the end of the ruined row in silence. "You going to be all right?" she asked him. "I should have caught it earlier," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have. Now you know what to look for." He nodded, jaw tight. "Curtis," she said. "The land doesn't hold a grudge. Tomorrow it's the same ground it was today." He looked at her then with an expression she recognized, because she had seen it on her father's face and on Gerald's and on her own in the mirror during the bad years, the look of someone who needed to hear something true and had just heard it. They had the Creamery apartment livable by September, as promised. It was not grand. Maren had plastered the walls herself over 2 weekends with Curtis mixing for her, and she had painted them the color of thick cream because that seemed right for what the building had been. There was a wood stove and a narrow iron bed from the auction house in town and a table Curtis had built from boards salvaged from the collapsed section of the dairy barn. He moved in on a Saturday evening and Maren brought a pot of vegetable stew and 2 bowls and they ate at that table in the new room with the wood stove going and the creak sound coming through the window and nothing else much needing to be said. The harvest that fall was not a miracle. Maren would not have called it that, and she disliked the word when she heard it applied to farming, because miracles were things that happened to you and this was something they had done. The numbers were real. The accounts were real. The checks from the restaurants came in the mail and Maren put them in the account at the credit union in Harlan. She had moved her account from First Savings Bank in the spring, quietly, without ceremony, and by November she had paid the property taxes on the Clover Branch place, replenished her seed stock, covered the cost of the compost amendment, paid Curtis his wages for the season, and set aside enough to buy a small walk-behind tractor with a rototiller attachment from a man in Bell County who was retiring. She had $400 left over. She sat at her kitchen table with her checkbook and the yellow legal pads, and she went over the numbers 3 times, because she did not trust good news on the first reading, and the numbers said the same thing each time. She had done it. Not easily. Not without aching joints and pre-dawn mornings and weeks where the math looked impossible, and one evening in late July when a hailstorm came up the valley so fast she had no time to do anything but stand in the doorway of the spring house and watch it beat the tomato plants for 8 minutes, after which she had walked the rows in the sudden sun and assessed the damage with a steadiness that cost her something she could not name but that she paid without hesitation. Not without the 4 in the morning nights and the weeks of driving to Lexington and back on the same day, the heavy coolers and the restaurant back doors and the awkward conversations with chefs who were busy and skeptical, and then, once they'd tasted the food, suddenly and completely not. Not without the loneliness that is particular to working land alone, which is different from other kinds of loneliness because it comes with great beauty and with the company of growing things, but is still loneliness and deserves its name. She had done it. December came with early snow and the fields went quiet under white, and Maren walked the bottom ground in the late afternoon, the snow still falling in the windless cold, and stood in the center of what had been her best tomato block, the one that had produced those sunset-colored heirlooms that Chandra had photographed and put on her menu, and that had come back to Maren one afternoon as a printed description on a menu card: heirloom tomatoes from Clover Branch Farm, Harlan County, Kentucky. She had kept that menu card. It was in the drawer with her father's notebook. She stood in the snow and thought about her father and about what he had written in that careful, cramped hand 60 years ago. This ground would grow anything you asked it to. She had not saved the farm. Her farm, the Colley place 2 miles up the road, was still hers and still modest and still functional in the way of things that are tended but not flourishing. What she had done was find new ground and ask it the right question and listen to what it answered and work with what it told her, which is not a miracle but is perhaps the oldest thing farmers know how to do. Back before there were words for it, back when it was just the relationship between human hands and earth, which is a relationship older than language and more reliable than most. Clete Harbison found her standing there. He had walked the lane in his heavy coat, she hadn't heard him come, and he stood at the field edge looking at her in the snow. "Ed Pierce's boy told me what you pulled in this season," Clete said. He had a way of opening a conversation in the middle. Maren looked at him. Ed Pierce's boy ought to mind his business. He ought to, Clete agreed. "Can I ask you something?" "Come on then." Clete picked his way through the snow to where she stood. He was a big man, had been bigger once, and he walked with the deliberate care of someone who knows their knees are not what they were. He stood beside her and looked at the field. Snow had covered the row markers and the landscape was clean and white and still. "You knew what this ground was," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "My father wrote it down in 1963, Maren said. "I kept what he wrote." Clete was quiet a moment. "Your daddy was a smart man." "He was," Maren said. "You're smarter." Maren shook her head. "I just paid attention." "That's what smart is," Clete said simply. They stood in the snow for a while without talking, which is a thing you can do with people you've known your whole life. The creek was audible from where they stood, the water running under a skim of ice at the edges, the sound of it continuous and low and patient. The ridge above was dark with bare trees against the white sky. A single crow crossed from east to west, low over the timber, and was gone. "Boyd Mackey was at the feed store again last week," Clete said. "Still calling it the $800 place." Maren smiled. "Let him. He'd have put it in corn," Clete said. "Maybe soybeans. Run it the same way he runs everything else." He paused. "Wouldn't have been the same." "No," Maren said. "It wouldn't." Because this was the truth she had always known about land, which is that it is not indifferent but it is particular. Ground this rich, this specific in its gifts, needed to be worked in the specific way that would honor what it was. You could put corn on it and the corn would do fine and the ground would give what corn takes and nothing more would happen. Or you could learn what the ground could actually be, which was something you couldn't learn from the outside, from a truck window or a county plat map, but only by walking it in different weathers and digging into it and reading what a careful man had written about it 60 years before, and by simply paying attention, which is a skill that looks like nothing from the outside but is in fact everything. The money Boyd Mackey would have made from corn in one season on that ground would not have equaled what Maren made from vegetables in her first growing year. She had done the math. She had done it partly out of curiosity and partly out of the quiet pleasure of being right in a way no one could argue with. Chandra called in November to talk about the next season. She wanted more. She wanted the early spring greens starting as soon as possible, and she wanted to know if Maren could grow certain herbs she'd been sourcing from out of state. She wanted to put Clover Branch Farm's name on her menu permanently, with a note about the farm and the county, because her diners asked about provenance and she wanted to be able to tell them something real. She wanted to know if Maren had thought about doing any preserved things, fermented, pickled, dried herbs, that could carry through the winter months. Maren had thought about it. She had thought about almost nothing else in her planning hours since July. The spring house along the creek was stone and cool and would hold a constant 58 degrees year-round, which was ideal for fermentation. The creamery building itself had been designed for exactly the kind of temperature-controlled food work she was imagining. The infrastructure of what the Duttons had built 70 years ago for dairy was, with certain modifications she had already sketched out on her yellow pads, almost perfectly suited to what she wanted to do. She talked to Chandra for 45 minutes on the kitchen phone, the cord stretched to its full length so she could pace, which she did when she was thinking hard about something good. When she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window and at the dark outside and at the weak reflection of herself in the glass. She was 54 years old. She had $400 in the credit union and a piece of extraordinary ground that she was only beginning to understand how to use, and a boy who was learning alongside her and who would one day know this ground better than she did, and that thought did not diminish her but expanded her somehow, the way thinking about the future should feel when the future is something you've built with your own hands. She got up and put the kettle on. Spring came the way it always does in Harlan County, slowly and then all at once. The redbuds came out on the ridge in early April, that particular purple-pink that is the most hopeful color in the world if you've been through a Kentucky winter, and the creek rose with snowmelt from the upper elevations and then settled back into its spring clarity, running green gold over the limestone shelf below the spring house. Curtis planted the first succession of lettuce on April 4th, working alone because Maren was at the extension office in town giving a short talk. Kevin had asked her, tentatively, apologetically, as though he expected her to say no, on soil health and cover cropping for a group of younger farmers who were struggling to find their way. She had said yes. She had not prepared notes. She stood at the front of the extension office conference room and talked for an hour about what she knew, about the soil notebook her father had kept and what it had taught her about paying attention, about the relationship between fallow years and soil health, about the economics of specialty crops on ground that most people were using for commodity production, about the Clover Branch place and what it had been and what it was becoming. There were 12 farmers in the room. 2 of them were women. One of the women, a young person of about 30 who raised goats on a small holding near Everett's, raised her hand at the end and said, "How did you know it would work?" Maren thought about the question for a moment. "I didn't," she said. "I knew the ground was right. I knew the market was there if I could reach it. I knew I could do the work." She paused. "That's different from knowing it would work. You don't ever know that. You just decide that the risk is worth more than not trying." The young woman with the goats nodded slowly, writing something in a small notebook. Maren watched her write and thought of her father and his marbled notebook and the patience of things set down in pencil for someone else to find. The second season at Clover Branch was larger. They added a 1/4 acre of the upper terrace that Maren had spent the winter amending with a combination of compost and aged chicken litter from a neighbor, and she put in specialty melons there that would not have thrived in the heavy-bottom soil. She negotiated a 3rd delivery run to Lexington. She hired Curtis full-time and paid him a real wage with a small percentage of the net at season's end, because that was the only fair arrangement and because fairness was a form of economy she believed in. Boyd Mackey drove past the gate on the county road in June and slowed to look at what was growing. He did not stop. His Dodge pickup continued up the road at a reduced speed and then resumed its normal pace and passed out of sight around the curve. Maren saw him from the field but didn't wave and did not wave. She simply watched him go and then went back to what she was doing, which was tying the second flush of tomatoes and thinking about drainage improvements along the east edge of the main block. Clete Harbison stopped in one morning in July when the fields were at the height of their fullness, That midsummer moment when everything you planted is simultaneously at its absolute best and the work of harvesting and selling is so relentless you barely have time to look at what you've grown. He stood at the field edge and looked at the rows for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Maren, who was clipping basil with both hands moving in the steady automatic rhythm of a woman who has been clipping basil for 30 years. "Your daddy would have loved this," he said. Maren stopped clipping. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He would have. He knew about this ground. He wrote it down," she said. "I kept what he wrote." Cleet looked at the fields again, at the stone creamery building with its tall windows now gleaming because Curtis had cleaned them in the spring and the light came through and fell across the stone floor inside where the fermentation crocks sat in their rows, at the spring house with its freshly pointed mortar and its repaired door, at the young man moving along a row of pepper plants in the far block with the sure-footed steadiness of someone who knows where they are. "People are talking differently now," Cleet said. Maren went back to her basil. "What are they saying?" "Boyd Mackey told someone he'd offered you $20,000 for the property," Cleet said, with a slight inflection that said he knew this was not quite how it had happened. "Boyd Mackey," Maren said, "can keep his $20,000 and his opinion about what I should do with my land." Cleet smiled. It was a full smile, which was rare for him. "That's more or less what I told him you'd say," he said. The offer was real, though not from Boyd Mackey but from a development company out of Knoxville, whose letter had arrived in April and whom Maren had not answered and whose second letter she had not answered either. The Clover Branch place had begun to mean something in the region that it had not meant 6 months earlier, not just for what it grew but for what it represented. The idea that ground everyone had dismissed could be, with the right knowledge and the right work and the right stubbornness, something extraordinary. Chandra had written about it on her restaurant's social media presence, which Maren did not use but which Curtis monitored and reported to her. There had been a journalist from a Lexington paper who had called the extension office and Kevin had given her Maren's number, and Maren had agreed to a short interview because Kevin had asked kindly and because she thought the story might be useful to other small farmers in the county who needed to see that there were ways through that didn't involve selling out or giving up. The article ran in October, toward the end of the second harvest season. It was on the front page of the features section of the Lexington paper, with a photograph of Maren standing in the bottom field with one hand resting on a tomato cage and looking directly at the camera with an expression the journalist described in her notes, though not in the article, as formidable. The headline was something Maren found slightly embarrassing, and the article made her sound more deliberate and visionary than she would have claimed to be. But there was a paragraph near the end that she cut out and put in the drawer with her father's notebook and the menu card from Chandra's restaurant. "Colley says the land told her what to do, if you're willing to listen." She learned to listen from her father, who farmed this same county for 40 years and who, in a worn-out notebook she keeps in her nightstand, left a record of what the soil was and what it could be. "He wrote it down for someone," she says. "I think he was writing it for me." The notebook was not all she had inherited. She had inherited his patience, which is the quality that farming actually requires above all others, the patience that is not passive but active, that knows the difference between a problem that needs immediate action and a problem that needs to be watched, that can hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely, that can let the season do what the season does and respond with skill to what it finds. She had inherited his eye for soil, his particular way of seeing the color and texture of ground and knowing without analysis what it was and what it wanted. She had inherited his habit of writing things down. She had started her own notebook, a marbled cover like his, in which she kept observations dated and specific, rainfall amounts from her own coffee can nailed to the corner of the creamery barn, soil temperatures in different blocks at different dates, notes on what grew where and how and what the ground was telling her. She had inherited, perhaps most importantly, his conviction that patience applied to the right place in the right way was worth more than any amount of money or machinery or chemical program. That the land, treated with respect and understanding, would return something that couldn't be purchased or shortcut or faked, something that tasted and felt and smelled like exactly what it was, which was real. The 3rd October at Clover Branch was warm and long. The kale and chard ran almost to Thanksgiving without frost damage. The fall tomatoes, which Maren had pushed into a microclimate she'd identified along the south wall of the creamery, a pocket of warmth from the stone that held daytime heat into the cool nights, kept producing into the last week of October, 2 weeks past when any tomato had any business still producing in Harlan County, Kentucky. Curtis harvested the last of them on a Saturday afternoon in brilliant slanted autumn light, moving along the row with a picking basket, and Maren watched from the corner of the Creamery building and thought that this was one of the finest sights she had seen in a long life of looking at growing things. She thought about her father. She thought about what he would say, standing here at the edge of this field in the October light, this ground he had written about and left to someone else to find the use of. She thought he would not say much. He had not been a man who spoke when looking would do. He would stand where she was standing and he would look at the rows and at the stone buildings and at the boy moving along the last of the tomatoes, and after a while he would nod, the particular single nod he'd had for things that were right. She thought about the $800 they said she'd paid. She had never bothered to correct it. 800, 1500, the number wasn't the point. The point was that no one else had stopped their truck and gotten out and walked that ground in different weathers and read what an old farmer had written about it 60 years before and decided that the risk was worth more than not trying. The point was that when the auctioneer said sold, she was the only one who knew what had been sold. Not the land itself, the land had always been there, holding its potential in the dark, waiting with the patience of ground that has been accumulating richness for 10,000 years and has no reason to rush. What had been sold was the chance to be the person who asked it the right question. And that chance, at any price, was not a bargain. It was a gift. She walked back across the field as Curtis brought the last basket in, the grass still green at the edges where the irrigation had reached, the soil dark and soft underfoot, the creek running clear over its limestone bed below the spring house, the ridge above going gold and rust in the afternoon light, the whole small world of it real and solid and earned in hers. She did not think about what Boyd Mackey would say at the feed store. She did not think about the development company in Knoxville and their letters she had not answered. She thought about the planting schedule she was working out for the spring, about the new variety of dry beans she wanted to trial in the upper terrace block, about the drainage improvement she and Curtis had planned for the east edge, about the cover crop she would get in the ground before the first hard frost, rye and hairy vetch, which would winter kill to leave the soil covered and enriched and ready. She was already thinking about next year. That is what farmers do. That is what farmers have always done. You put the season to rest and you think about the next one. You look at what the land gave you and you think about what to ask it for next. You keep the notebook. You pay attention. You do the work. And in the spring, when the ground warms in the particular way that bottom ground along a limestone creek warms earlier than the fields above, brighter with mineral and dark with age, you start again. The crow crossed over the field, east to west, low over the timber, and was gone. The creek ran on. The soil held everything the years had given it, patient and dark and ready.